back once more.
And you're with us, and you're here with Gunnar together with Seuss. We're so glad you're with us. Hang around, we're going to cover some really interesting ideas today, and you're going to find out, or at least have enough information to work out yourself, are you living in the Matrix? Are we living in a simulation? Now, the more I've read about this subject, the more I'm actually starting to doubt that reality is something which happens independently and is objectively verifiable. You remember the old story? What happens if a tree falls in the forest? Does it make any noise? Here's the answer to you for this. We'll start with something easy and we'll go on. Yes, if a tree falls in a forest, it does make noise. However, it's not recognised as sound unless there's somebody or something there to actually record it or to interpret it. This is a really good start for understanding whether we're living in a simulation or not. Let me explain to you. You've probably heard about the light double slit experiment. Light, generally the way that it behaves, it moves in a wave format, okay? But if in fact it's observed or if it's recorded in a double slit experiment, it changes from a wave behavior to a single particle. This is a stupefying thing. What it means is that by observing something, and even if it's not a human there to observe it, but in fact we have a camera that's capable of recording it. Let's say it's just simply recorded, even not by a human mind, it changes the behavior of light. What does that mean? Well, it's actually earth-shattering when you think about it, because how can it be that reality only actually occurs when it's observed or recorded? Think about it this way. You're playing a computer game. You've got a character and he's got a rifle and he's in a room and he's fighting zombies. The computer doesn't care what's going on in the next room. The next room hasn't even been thought about. It's not been rendered. That reality has not been rendered. The zombies or the other monsters in the next chamber, they don't even exist. There's a possibility for them. That's very similar to what reality is. Reality is something which is only digitally rendered when there's a consciousness or a recording device there to actually bring it into being. You see, the way that things work is this way. Things exist at a quantum level, that's the smallest level you can think of, in a superposition in a wave. Now, for someone like me, as a statistician, that makes a lot of sense because everyone's seen things like the bell curve, and you can understand that people vary in height. You'd have people generally from about 4'5" up to say 6'10". Let's say that's generally a wave pattern. That's how things occur. Think about things on a quantum level. Things can occur in a distribution similar to that, but it will only come into reality what property they have when it's observed. Now here's the question. Do we live in something like the Matrix, or don't we? You've seen the film The Matrix, haven't you, Sus?
I do, and more I think about it, I reckon, you know, in a different universe, I would actually be Keanu Reeves.
Oh. Well, I would, in a different universe, be spending time with Monica Bellucci.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
She was in the second and the third. It's really what made The Matrix worthwhile for me. What about you, kiddies?
Yeah.
There's so much which comes from this. What is the purpose of existence, and what would give cause to the purpose of reality? You might remember from the days of going back when you went to Sunday school or church, and you remember the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis, and the people were building a tower and they were working together under a unified language, and the plural of God was talking amongst itself, or maybe it was in a council, a holy council, or simply using the royal us and saying the people are united under a common language and will become great. Is that what's really happening as our technology is progressing? And does it mean there's actually a limit to the reality that we're currently living in now? Now let me take us back a step. Imagine we're living in a scenario. It's easy to imagine what a scenario is. For example, when I was a young man and I got my pay, I decided that I'd do a spreadsheet and work out how much I earned and how much I'd spend. I'd have X amount of money for petrol, I'd go out to a nightclub once a week, and I'd have takeaway, and maybe if I got lucky, I'd have money for some good perfume or something like that for the evening.
Did you actually do that?
I wrote the list. It doesn't mean I was faithful to the list. So what I ended up doing, like most people did, is that was version 1.0, 1.1, 1.11, 1.2. It ended up just going in a file on a 3.5-inch floppy disk, and it's sitting there somewhere in landfill right now as we talk about. The same as when I played a lot of computer games and I had, let's say I was playing Tomb Raider and I had Lara Croft and she was stuck in the middle of a dungeon and that scenario was too hard for me, so I basically just put that disc away or saved it on the hard drive and I'll revisit it another day. But I haven't, and Lara Croft is stuck in that limbo forever. Or in fact those numbers on the Excel spreadsheet are set there doing recursive arithmetic without end. Sound a bit like human suffering? Let's talk about the human zoo. The human zoo is very similar to, say, something like the Matrix, where you've got people who are batteries. That's their sole purpose in the Matrix. Remember that?
Yes.
They're creating power for the overlords. Or it could actually be that they're running through a simulation to find out an answer to something. I mean, this sounds all very grandiose and sounds like we're sort of emptying ourselves in each other's pockets. But imagine if we could come up with some tools to work out if, in fact, we are living in a simulation. Remember, the reality we're living in now is a digital reality where reality will only be rendered once there is a conscious mind or recording device to experience it.
There's only one trouble with that, with that thought process. That whatever it is that we may come up with to establish in a digital universe or a reality could in itself be part of that digital creation. So we may think we're actually coming up with a solution, but that's something that was thought up for us to come up as part of the game.
It could be, and that could be part of the idea of human suffering, and the reason why under a number of religions the idea of a nirvana, like Buddhism, a freedom from suffering was the end goal in itself. Go back to ancient Greek thought where the only way to cheat the gods was to take one's own life. Again, that was the only liberation he had, or the only way to escape the scenario. Not advocating it. There are some tests which we can use to find out if in fact we're living in a reality or not. Have a think about this. Tell me what you think. If we were living in a rendered universe, a simulation, there'd be some things that would let us know. For example, there would be an end degree as to how far back you could go to find information. For example, you have your favourite photo on camera and you just happen to expand it again and expand it again. You know what I'm talking about. Eventually it becomes so pixelated that that area of skin you're interested in can no longer be rendered any more precise. It is pixelated to the finest degree. Well, have a look at matter and have a look at how we understand energy at the moment. The Greeks had a concept for atomos, that which cannot be cut because it's the smallest possible pixelated piece of information or matter there is. We've since discovered, in fact, you can go past the atomic level. But again, you can pixelate that to a final degree. That's quite uncanny, isn't it? A little bit spooky. Have a think about if we actually lived in a simulation that would have to have some limits put in place. We'll have a look at the limit, for example, of the speed of light, which is the fastest that matter can possibly travel at. So 298,000 kilometers per second. Matter cannot travel beyond that speed now after the Big Bang. Why, in fact, is there a limit at all if this is not a rendered universe that had to have some limitations programmed into it?
But that's a limitation that we understand at this moment. That doesn't mean that that is the final limitation.
I'm going to talk further about that in a moment, but in terms of mass, it certainly is the final that we have. But I'll come back to that because it's a really good point. If we lived in a simulation, then you'd expect it would be mathematically defined. Lo and behold, this simulation or this scenario that we live in is perfectly mathematically defined. For example, if we look at gravity, okay, 9.8 meters per second. Gravity we can measure. We don't fully understand it, but we can measure its relationship to mass. These relationships can be drawn. There are mathematical relationships that exist here. It's all sounding quite incredible, isn't it? What if we could have a relationship then between two parts in the universe? Let's call them quantums, the smallest bits we can possibly have from distant sizes and spaces of the universe, so that if I was to change the position or the rotation or the spin of one, the other one would react automatically faster than the speed of light, that is instantaneously in the opposite direction. Now that's a spooky action, and that spooky action was so named by Einstein because he was so perplexed by that. The more that we think of it, the more this seems to make sense. You might have seen some films or read some books by a science fiction writer called Philip K. Dick. I know, Sus, I know that you're into sci-fi. You've probably seen... I read the book several times, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, that became Blade Runner?
Yes.
And what about The Man in the High Castle? I've recently read that as well. If you haven't read the book, it's available on Amazon Prime in a couple of series to watch. Philip K. Dick, when he wrote this book, was drawing from his own personal recollection of history. His way of working out if we were living in a proper, objectively verifiable universe or a simulation was to say, okay, if we were living in a simulation, there would have to be some glitches. Or there would have to be some memory as to a universe that could have happened, an alternate universe at the same time. Now for him, the world in which Japan and Germany had actually won the Second World War and carved up the eastern and western coasts mostly of the United States, was one which wasn't a fantasy to him, but actually a reality. This in his mind actually happened. And you say, well, okay, he was fairly out there and he wasn't necessarily always in his right state of mind. But what about shared recollections that other people have? What about things like the Mandela effect?
Yes.
Now, the Mandela effect, Sus, is basically, some people recall that Nelson Mandela was not freed from prison in South Africa, that in fact he died, and that there was a procession with Winnie and with his coffin through the streets in South Africa. Whereas we know in our reality what actually happened was that he was set free. He eventually became president of South Africa. What about the Monopoly guy with or without the monocle? I still remember the image of the Monopoly guy with the monocle. But in fact, he never wore a monocle. So how is this happening? Is this an oops? Is this a resetting of our reality? Is this, let's say, a rerunning of a scenario? Let's say that reality exists for this reason. To run it to a logical conclusion, to see what would happen under certain constraints. How would people behave? How would resources be used? Now, you're probably like my family, and I know Sus as well, you're into running a lot of those simulation games. And simulation games are great when they're converted to things like warfare. Warfare is a simulation game, and it's a logistics resource game.
Yeah,
how
correct.
do we allocate these resources, human lives, ammunition, artillery, iron for railroads, etc., to fulfill the thing? What's the most efficient way of doing that? If you think about things done for efficiency, there's probably an ethic to do that. So if a universe or a world or a simulation, let's say you're playing Sid Meier's Civilization 4, 5, 6, 7, and you're running it, and then you grow tired of it, you put it away in your desk, but it continues to run, is that not similar to the universe that we're living in now? Now think about this. Any simulation you live in is likely to be a facsimile to some extent of the technology that fathered it. Okay, so it's like a grandfather simulation. Technology evolved to a certain state, and so we will run the technology back 100 years or so and see how the simulation could actually run, given some slightly different circumstances, or how could we get the end goal that we want. And you think about it, the film The Matrix was just that. Remember? It was wound back to just before the war.
Yes.
And to the environmental degradation. So in fact, if a scenario ran to see what happened, and if we didn't get the result we wanted, we could reset it. If Germany and Japan won the Second World War and we decided that wasn't what we wanted, or the overlords did, they could rerun it, and suddenly you've got the alliance, the Axis, that wins it.
Yep.
It's really quite fascinating to think about. For myself, the more that I read into it, the more I find it, first off, it's hard to contest. It's a logical fallacy to say that, well, this reality is not real, because you really cannot draw any conclusions from it. But again, go back to those metrics that I gave you of things like looking at limitations such as the speed of light, look at communication such as a spooky action of particles that have got a quantum entanglement with it. Have a look at the mathematical operability of what's going on now, and then have a look again back to the history and some of our shared philosophical thoughts of things like a nirvana, which is a freedom from all of this suffering and what we're going through, the human zoo condition, and you really start to think, is this in fact possible? What are your thoughts, Zeus?
My thoughts are, do you remember the original Sim City that we used to play on an Amiga 500?
Yeah.
That was the first colour computer that we ever possessed. And you could put in alternative scenarios. You could have, you could run it at the basic level and you're just building a city to its optimum. Then you can put in variables like monsters, monsters coming in, or aliens, or whatever, and how that would change how you build and everything else. It's hard to analyse, but really, to us as an individual, does it matter?
It matters entirely, because if you think about the purpose of living is basically to analyse your life. Remember, the idea of the examined life is the life worth living, and the life which is not examined basically is fruitless. It's worthless. It has no purpose at all. And for those who are breeders, who have children, the idea of bringing more life into a world of suffering without examination is frankly a scary thing as well. Now, we're also prisoners by the very fact that, let's say that we are living in our reality. Physicists know that there are more than just the 3 dimensions in which we live. For example, there are multiple dimensions of time. That in itself is actually quite an interesting thing. Some of these dimensions are so incredibly tiny, they're at a microscopic level. So the world that we're living in, what is present to us is only that one dimension of time, but we know for a fact there are more than one dimensions of time. In terms of the 3 dimensions, the length, width and height, and then we add to that the one dimension of time. If we were to be, let's say, invaded, or we were to receive as hosts something from a higher dimension, we could only perceive part of it in physicality in the dimensions in which we live in now.
Yes.
That's
right.
Really quite incredible. For example, if you were living in a 2-dimensional world and you were to receive a balloon that came from above and descended, you would only recognise that by a point, a sharp point which would come through, or 1 pixelation point that would come through. That would be the base of the balloon. That's how a 2-dimensional world would conceive something coming in from a 3-dimensional world. Now, for us, living in this physical reality, for us, whether it's scenario or not, anything from a higher dimension will only be perceived by us in the confines of the dimensions in which we live.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there's physical and there's also philosophical reasons as to why it's important. In terms of spiritual reasons, this is really important, because in fact, if we don't exist, then the idea of predeterminism comes in and our free will is out the window. If I'm pre-programmed to act in a certain way, then it doesn't matter. I don't have my own volition to say I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that.
It's already predetermined, pre-programmed.
I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this. I suggest you have a look, do a little bit of reading for yourself, and I think it's going to really open up your eyes. And for sure, the next time you see The Matrix,
you look at it a completely different way.
Yeah, looking at more than Monica Bellucci. Although I'll be looking at Monica Bellucci. And if you like what you see and what you hear, join us for more at Zeusology.
It's a brave new world out there.
We'll see you soon.
Ciao, ciao.